Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni moli wanji, namaste, jumbo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jed Lee, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted and so very honored that you are joining us in our mission to help families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to tell all of your family and friends about the show and subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, wherever you find your podcast. Our guest today is Susan Fletcher. She is taking us back in time to celebrate a bear far from home. Before we invite Susan into the studio, we want to let you know that this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by the adventures of Toby Baxter, the River Elf, the Giant, and the Closet. Great middle grade novel by Tim Wright. He's ready to leave kiddom behind, but can Toby Baxter stand tall against an army of barf-inducing beasts? Toby can't wait to be a teenager. On the cusp of turning 13, the superhero-obsessed boy's jaw drops when a baffling stranger appears and begs him for help. But when Toby's led through a portal on a whirlwind trip to a magical land, he's terrified to be plunged mid-battle between elves and a legion of stinky trolls. You and your kids are going to absolutely love this great middle grade novel, The Adventures of Toby Baxter, the River Elf, the Giant, and the Closet by Tim Wright. This episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is also brought to you by Snowmen at Halloween, a delightful picture book by Carolyn and Mark Diener. Have you ever built a snowman and discovered that the next day his grin is a little crooked, or that he's a little shorter than the day before? Maybe you're like me and you've wondered, what do snowmen do at night when no one's watching? You're going to have a great time finding out. This is a really wonderful book, and it's a delightful addition to the best-selling Snowmen at Night series. In Mark Diener's charming illustrations, you'll not only find an array of amazingly costumed snowmen enduring a nighttime Halloween parade, carnival game, caramel apples, ghost stories, and trick-or-treating, but you'll want to return again and again to find the hidden pictures on every page. Get your copy today, Snowmen at Halloween by Carolyn and Mark Diener. Join us right now from College Station in the great state of Texas. Our guest is here today to celebrate a really beautiful historical nonfiction picture book. It's called A Bear Far From Home. Please welcome to the show, Susan Fletcher. Hey, Susan, how are you?
Hey, Jen. Good. How are you?
I'm wonderful. I can't wait for you to tell us about A Bear Far From Home. As I understand it, it involves a polar bear and a couple of kings.
It does. Absolutely. That's it in a nutshell. So in the year 1252, in the middle of the Middle Ages, King Håkon of Norway gave to King Henry III of England a polar bear. And the bear went and stayed in the menagerie in the Tower of London. So the amazing thing about this story is that they let the bear out of its cage. So menageries back in the Middle Ages were kind of zoos, but really kind of sad. You know, the animals were in small cages, and it was, it's very sad. But this bear, for some reason that is not recorded in history, was allowed outside of its cage and was allowed to hang out on the banks of the Thames River, chained up probably. But then the bear was also allowed off the chain and allowed into the river with a long, strong cord, which had been commissioned by King Henry, so that the bear could fish for salmon. I mean, speculation is that maybe the bear was very expensive to feed, and they thought, well, let the bear catch its own food. But I mean, this is a polar bear. And King Henry also commissioned, and we have this in paperwork, we have this in documents from the 13th century, that King Henry also commissioned a thick covering, a thick kind of a cloak for the bear's keeper to go into the water while the bear was fishing for salmon. So I read about that and I thought, oh man, I've got to write about that.
That is really incredible. I mean, you know, you think about the police officers who go into elementary schools and do the sort of demonstrations with the police dogs, and they have the patting on their arm. But this is that on steroids, because polar bears, they're nasty creatures.
They're really dangerous. I mean, they're endangered, so we love them. They're also adorable when you see the pictures of them, you know, but they're super, super dangerous. So the fact that this, you know, and they have documentation that this happened. In fact, if you go to the Tower of London, there's actually a sculpture of this bear right about where the bear would have been chained at the side of the Thames River. So it's sort of a famous bear in the annals of the menagerie.
Wow. So how in the world did an author in College Station, Texas, find out about this polar bear that lived in the 1200s in England?
Well, you know, I like to read, and I stumbled across a book by Daniel Hahn about the menagerie at the Tower of London, and it's a 600-year-old thing where they had, you know, and again, I guess back in the olden days, instead of you know, giving them a piece of jewelry, you know, giving kings exchanging a piece of jewelry or a document or something like that, they gave them an animal from their country. So these things built up and they needed to have a place for them. And so they built a place in the Tower of London. Now, the bear was one of the first ones to come to the Tower of London. The menagerie was elsewhere, first of all. But so we don't know exactly where in the Tower of London complex that bear was kept. But eventually, we do know they built, they built big stone enclosures for them and stuff like that, so that you can see if you go there now. Wow. So anyway, but the, you know, the bear is famous because they let the poor guy, you know, they let her out of her cage. I'm calling her a female because, male polar bears are even more dangerous than female polar bears. So I'm thinking, if they had one that was fishing in the river with her keeper, you know, probably was a female polar bear, although nobody knows for sure. I'm just guessing.
It really is mind-boggling to think about it. And as I'm listening to the story, I'm thinking that this could be a really fascinating book that can launch all sorts of really interesting conversations within a family as they're experiencing this book together. What are some of the things you think a family might talk about? Well,
you know, I was so attracted to this to the story of this bear, and I think it was partly because of, you know, what we've just described, that how come they let the bear out? That's just astonishing. But then as I got to thinking about it more, so when I was a kid, we moved in the middle of the school year a couple of times, and it's like moving to a foreign country. You know, when you move from Ohio to California or back again, you know, the culture is different. The kids are at different stages of development. So like when I moved from Ohio back to California, in Ohio, we were still, you know, hiking in the woods, playing kickball. You know, the girls were pretending that boys were icky, although we really didn't think so yet, but we couldn't admit, you know. So we moved to California, and everybody's listening to the cool beach music. They got the cool clothes. They're starting to go steady, you know. And so it was, you know, it was a long time in both cases before the new place felt like home. And so I started thinking about the bear in that way, thinking about the bear going from one place that was so different from the other place, and, you know, wanting, you know, just sort of wanting the bear to eventually sort of feel like oh, now this new place is my home.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that was another way I was thinking about it. And, if you look at the book, the illustrator, Rebecca Green, has done such a wonderful job of showing the emotions of the bear. So the bear is sort of an analog for a kid
Mm-hmm.
who's been dragged from one place to another and trying to make it feel like home.
Yeah, that's, I kind of grew up in the same place for my childhood, and half the people in my neighborhood I was related to, and that was kind of annoying sometimes because I try to get away with something, and an adult would come up and grab me by the scruff of the neck, and I go, "You can't do that to me." And they say, "I'm your uncle." I'm like, "Oh, what do you mean you're my uncle?" But, so I can't relate to, moving from one part of the world to the other, even one part of the States to another. But that is, I think, a great conversation to have with our kids, because even if a kid is growing up like me and in the same neighborhood that their parents grew up in and that their grandparents still live in, they're going to have classmates who are moving. And so it's important to have not only talk for the kids who are moving around to have those conversations, but the kids who are more in a more stable spot to kind of say, hey, what do you think your friends are going through? And how can we make their transition a little bit easier?
Yeah, I love that idea. Because when I moved, because I'm sort of a shy person, and so I remember when I moved to Ohio in the middle of the second grade, I was afraid to, everybody already had, it was the middle of the school year, everybody had their friends, it was all set, and so I remember one time I was just too shy, and I would stand outside on the playground and not play with anybody. But one time these 3 girls all came up to me and asked if I want to hang out with them. And it was a huge and wonderful gift to me. And so I love the idea of using this book to talk not only to people who are moving and saying, someday this will feel like home to you.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be okay,
Yeah.
but to the kids who are already sort of stable there, seeing somebody coming in from outside and, giving some idea of what they might be feeling like.
Yeah. I think that's so important. And what a beautiful story that could be, writing that book about your experience as a second grader.
Well, that's a thought. I've never thought about writing directly about that, but it was rough. And I think it would be less rough if I were more of an extrovert, but it was really hard. So by the time I did the next move, I had learned something. And, one of the things I learned was to join in the games, even if you're scared to, even if you're going to look stupid because you've never played this game before, just get in line with the Foursquare game, join up with the kickball game, just get in there and, and jump in. So I learned my own lesson from, from having, made some mistakes in second grade.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say, and this is back to writing about this subject, that one of the things that was hard about it is it's so long ago and there's so little documentation. I mean, we have these records of the king having ordered the long, strong cord and the wrap for the keeper and a muzzle and a chain and things like that. But we don't have much else. So I had to sort of, in order to write the story, I had to sort of think, what might have happened? How might this have happened? So how would they have gotten there? So I thought, well, it must have been a boat. He must have come on a boat, and it must have been, I did some research on the kinds of boats that there were. It must have been this kind of boat. And so I wrote the story in that way, not saying she did this, but saying in the places where I have big gaps in the research, which was lots of places. I had to say, well, she must have, and then also inviting the reader to imagine what it must have been like. Because, again, we don't know. So imagine what it would be like to be taken away from your home and put on this boat and tossed around, it's the solid ground is taken away from you. And so it was a fun challenge to write a nonfiction book. So I couldn't put anything in there that didn't happen, but without saying it must have, or inviting the reader to imagine what that would be like.
Yeah. I'm imagining that one of the things families can talk about is just that. Imagine what it would be like to live 600 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And how our attitude towards animals has changed over the years and really evolved.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that, the people who looked at those animals in those teeny little cages weren't thinking the same kinds of thoughts that we would have. And that is that's animal abuse. That's a horrible. But they were probably, and they also, they would not have seen, like when an elephant came to the menagerie the year after the bear. And so, they'd never seen an elephant. It must have been the same as if a dragon had come in. It must have seemed like a creature of, magical creature. But we're not thinking that way now. We're thinking, boy, that poor elephant.
Yeah.
Was stuck there in that little cage. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, that's the thing.
That we have evolved.
Yeah, that's the thing. 600 years ago, nowadays kids have seen elephants in circuses on TV, at a zoo, on the internet. Anytime we want to see a picture or video of an elephant, we can just type in and we can see it instantaneously. Back 600 years ago, it was right. It could be a once in a lifetime thing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I like to imagine is, that polar bear is swimming in the Thames River, right among all the boats and stuff like that. And, imagining those 13th century people looking at this sort of amazing, enormous, this thing that they would never see in their own country, swimming in the river. It must have seemed sort of like a miracle to them.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. What was the most surprising thing you discovered during your research about this book?
I think when I saw that the bear's keeper, that the king commissioned a thick wrap for the bear's keeper so the bear's keeper could go into the river with the bear. That just, wow. That sounds dangerous.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine I would keep him very warm anyway. Once he, it's just, it's hard to imagine.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I went to the Tower of London. I went to visit it and saw where the bear must have been and saw the statue of the bear. And they've got a whole exhibit on the menagerie, which is really interesting until you think about it too hard. And because we're, 21st century people, it's kind of sad, So the story is a little bittersweet, because the bear would have been happier back home, in Norway. But, the fact that the bear got to go into the river was a real, sort of a hopeful, lightening moment about the story.
Yeah, yeah. What is it about writing historical nonfiction that you enjoy the most?
This is the second historical nonfiction that I've written about an animal that did something extraordinary. My first one was about a cow that went through the Civil War, and I love animals, and I love knowing what happened to them in historical circumstances. I love writing about history. And it's hard for me to explain exactly why, but, I don't know. I'm very attracted to those kinds of subject matters.
Yeah. Well, I think it's wonderful. It sounds like A Bear Far From Home is one of the many books that we can use with our really young kids to get them excited and curious about history, and to get them thinking about it in a way that goes way beyond memorizing facts and dates and things like that, and really challenges our kids to use their imaginations, to think about what it was like to live during those times, to think about the challenges people had to overcome during those times, to think about how far we've come from those moments in time, and to think about where we can go next.
Yeah. How people lived in the Middle Ages, it's sort of an entry point into that kind of thing, that there were, that was a castle, the Tower of London was a castle, and the kind of boats that they used, they had no motors, they were sailboats, and the bear probably was strapped in a cage to the upper deck of the boat, and, what kind of conveniences that we take for granted that they didn't have back then, in the days when there were kings and queens, that ruled a lot of the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's sort of an entry point into to that, and then also an entryway into talking about polar bears and endangered species, and and why they're endangered, and things like that.
Yeah, and what we can do to help.
Sort of people like to enter into a subject with a story, and so the story can open up in different directions, I think.
Yeah. Susan, I know people are going to want to know where they can go to find out more about A Bear Far From Home and find out more about you.
Well, I have a website, so should I tell you what that is? Or it's SusanFletcher.com, about me. And the Bear Far From Home is not on sale yet. It'll be on sale, I think it's the 28th of September. So it should be around by then. The illustrator is Rebecca Green. And I'm not sure exactly what her website is, but I'm sure it's easy to find her. And her illustrations are just spectacular. I feel so fortunate, not only in the way that she brings the emotions of the bear to life, but also the way she brings the time and place alive. The medieval setting, the architecture, the costumes, and things like that. Also she does she shows sort of a difference visually between Norway and England. So you can see where the bear came from, where the bear went to, where home was and will be for the bear. So it's I feel so fortunate that she illustrated the book, because she really knocked herself out. It's a beautiful book.
That's wonderful. You kind of broke up when you were telling us about your website, but I believe you said it is SusanFletcher.com?
That's correct, yes.
Awesome. We've had a great time speaking about the historical nonfiction picture book, A Bear Far From Home, and our guest has been the author, Susan Fletcher. Hey, Susan, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much. This was really fun.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We have a fascinating conversation coming your way. Cynthia and Sanford Levinson are here to talk about their middle grade nonfiction, It's called Fault Lines in the Constitution. It's also available as a graphic novel. This is a really... I don't know. I feel like I graduated from law school after listening to Cynthia and Sanford. And not in a bad way, like I had to endure all years and years of law. No. It was a fun, really fascinating conversation about our Constitution, about our nation, about how we can make our nation even stronger. And without all the fighting and the rhetoric that we hear today. You're going to love it. I promise. You're going to love it. It's the next episode of the show. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, we want to start by thanking our guest, Susan Fletcher. Please be sure to check out A Bear Far From Home. Also want to thank our sponsors, Carolyn and Mark Diener. Please be sure to check out their beautiful picture book, Snowmen at Halloween. Also want to thank Tim Wright, the author of The Adventures of Toby Baxter, The River Elf, The Giant in the Closet, thrilling middle grade novel that is also a Reading with Your Kids certified great read. I want to thank my team, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Marabella Q. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.